Okay, educational technology for change, coding for climate change. So today I will be talking about this program that I created called Coding for Climate Change. It's available on my website for free. And so today I'll be sharing both what inspired me to create this project for my students, as well as different lessons in climate change. And then we'll go through a couple of coding activities that I was able to do with my students and relating it to climate change. Actually, before I begin officially, I just want to double check you guys can see my screen and everything when I was sharing it. If somebody wouldn't mind just typing in the chat and just saying, yes, we can see your screen. Perfect. Thank you so much, Sarah. All right, so let's begin. So a little bit about me. I'm a teacher at St. Michael's Choir School, which is in downtown Toronto. I teach grade 9 to 12 science and geography, as well as special education. As mentioned before this presentation, I was selected in 2020 as a Grosvenor Teacher Fellow with National Geographic and Lindblad Expeditions. It's a wonderful program. Any teacher can apply, and they send you on an expedition to explore how you can translate that expedition and that field-based experience into exciting resources that you share with educators, and you do like a 2-year commitment with them. So it's a fantastic opportunity. If you haven't applied already, you should definitely apply, and I'll be talking about that a little bit today, but I'll be focusing on the program that I created. I also really love learning. So today I'll be talking about how I learned something completely foreign to me, how to code. I really believe that, obviously I believe that learning is really fun, and I really enjoy the challenge. So whether it be learning a new instrument, I play a couple of instruments, learning languages, or reading scientific studies and incorporating that into my lessons, I'm really passionate about learning about learning new things. And this year I learned the most challenging thing ever, which is taking care of a newborn. So I am also a new mom to a beautiful boy, Nicholas. So today I'll be sharing lots of things that I learned, including some science and some geography related to climate change, which then I will be tying into the coding activities later in the presentation, facts that inspired me from my favorite books, and also I'll be sharing my journey of how I use coding to explore climate change. So as mentioned, the Grosvenor Teacher Fellowship with National Geographic and Lindblad Expeditions, they do send you on an expedition. So I will be going on an expedition to Antarctica in December. I am super excited about that. I'm very passionate about, learning more about the polar regions of the world, mostly because of how, there's melting glaciers, but also melting permafrost in those regions. So that's what this map is of. It's of the melting permafrost. As you can see, the Arctic is affected a little bit more than the Antarctic, though I'm really excited to see, that place in person, and in order to learn more about how climate change is impacting those regions. So today's presentation, I'll be talking about first, what inspired me to learn more about climate change, and what inspired me to learn something completely new and foreign, like coding. Then I'll be going through a couple of classroom activities. Then I'll be sharing a free resource that I've made available on my website for educators to access, Coding for Climate Change. And then I'll be going through a few activities in detail of that program that's available on my website to demonstrate how coding was used to learn about climate change, but also how it can be used as a tool to understand and visualize climate data. And then at the end, we can take questions and have a discussion. So part one, what inspired me? So I read this fantastic book. I don't know if anyone else here has read it. It's called The Brain That Changes Itself. And it's about neuroplasticity and how the brain changes, forms new connections, how you can still gain brain cells as you're aging. So it's really incredible. And it definitely inspired me because, it was once believed that as you you're born with all the brain cells you would use in your lifetime, and then they kind of just slowly die, and that there was no way to grow more brain cells. But this myth has been totally debunked by numerous studies, and obviously I learned about it in this book as well, and that the brain is extremely plastic. So you can change the way that your brain functions. You can reroute the brain. So you can see in this animation here, these are neurons creating new paths. And so you can really, grow more brain cells as you're aging. And so I really wanted to share with you a little bit about this topic, because it really did inspire me and motivate me to learn something such as coding, which is, really important these days, and then tie it to a geographic topic that I'm really passionate about. So a few fun facts about, the brain. So it was it was always believed that, in early childhood, that was the critical period. That's when you would be, it's a crucial period for learning, but you can still learn a lot in adulthood. What I did learn is that the main difference is that by the time you're an adult, you're just replaying mastered skills, and you're not actually learning a lot of new skills. So, when you're specializing in your career, you just become a user of those skills, versus actually learning new things in comparison to the amount you learn in early childhood or early adolescence. So we have this tendency to kind of deceive ourselves into thinking that we're learning as we were before, and we're not engaging in tasks that truly demand our full attention as closely as we did when we were younger. So, for example, having the same job for many years, speaking your own language, it's just a replay of mastered skills. So that's why learning a new language, such as a coding language, is really, really important, because it requires this intense focus. It requires your brain to create new pathways and even creates new brain cells. A study found that listening to new music has the same effect. You're forming new neural connections. You're connecting parts of your brain that were never connected before. The same thing with, they found that people with more education, who are more socially and physically active, their memory not only improves, but their chances of Alzheimer's disease or dementia decreases. And they actually also found that not all activities are the same. So they found that dancing, for example, because you're learning new moves, but you're also physically and mentally being challenged and requires a lot of attention, that creates a lot of new pathways in your brain. So, to continue to learn, you need to tackle new challenges. So that's what inspired me to take on this new challenge and learn how to code Python. And, what's also really interesting is that, over time, when you become really good at something, you're less likely to try new things, because that causes your mind to kind of be fixed in its pathways. So there's this great analogy of a snowy hill that was mentioned in the book. If the snow is untouched and it's nice and soft, you choose the path which you take down the hill with a sled. But once you take one path and the snow starts to harden, you're more likely to take the same path down the hill than to start exploring new paths. So that's kind of the same thing as our minds. You're more likely, once you become an expert at something, to not try something new. And so that motivated me to say, what, maybe I can learn something completely new like coding and explore it in maybe a different way that people don't usually use coding for, such as, exploring a topic that I'm passionate about, climate change. I really, really like this quote. It's by the Zen master Suzuki Roshi. In the beginner's mind, there are many possibilities, but in the expert's mind, there are few. So I decided to take on this project during COVID-19. The pandemic provided a lot of challenges, but it was also provided many opportunities to learn something new. For example, I had a lot of time. So I'm sure you've heard this fact. It's mentioned in a book called Outliers by Malcolm Gladwell, but he explains that it takes approximately 10,000 hours of intense practice to master a new skill, or a complex skill like playing the violin or getting as good as Bill Gates at coding. The idea is that mastery requires this enormous amount of time. This actually motivated me, even though 10,000 hours sounds kind of daunting, because it reassured me that even someone as expert as Bill Gates needed this amount of time to learn something new. so that, anyone can learn something new and not to be intimidated, because you just need to put the time and be patient. So that was something that motivated me. And I was pretty eager to receive help. Like, I did encounter a lot of challenges along the way learning how to code. There are a ton of online resources for sure that you could access, but I also decided to exchange my own skills. So I set up a virtual meeting with a friend. I taught him French, and he helped me, with learn some Python as well. So that was something that I did. And I also wanted to mention that I was able to receive a COVID-19 remote learning emergency fund for educators from the National Geographic. So there are really a ton of ways to receive financial aid if you do want to get some help starting a new program. So I applied to this grant, and I was able to purchase these coding kits for my students. So these grants do pop up periodically, so do keep an eye out if you're interested. Okay, so that brings me to, combining these two remote ideas, coding and climate change. I had taken a few graduate courses when I was taking my master's at OISE a while back, and I learned about creativity and how it's, simply put, the combination of two remote ideas. So for this project, I combined two things: coding, a new skill that I wanted to learn, and climate change. Though they're completely different and random, by combining something that I wanted to learn but was perhaps a little intimidated to learn with something that was meaningful to me, it actually motivated me to learn something that was challenging. So I'm obviously not the first person to combine technology and climate change in order to generate solutions. So I wanted to share this example with you. It's a creative project that combines technology and engineering with climate change solutions. We all know that glaciers in both the North and South Poles are melting due to climate change, especially the Arctic, as I mentioned earlier. So to tackle that problem, this design uses submarines to create more ice. So these submarines remove the salt from the water and then create hexagonal ice with the fresh water that interlock together in order to create like a larger mass of ice. So this design is actually not like currently being used. It's just a design, and it's not 100% feasible yet. It would take about 10 million submarines or something like that to replace all that polar ice that is being lost in the last 4 decades. So it's not 100% realistic, but it is nevertheless an excellent example of a creative project that combines technology with climate change. I really do love this quote. So richer countries have millions to spend on seawalls and protection. But what about poor countries with no budget for defending against rising sea levels? This is a problem the world now faces together. We have a different approach. Rather than defending against sea level rises, we think it's better to carry out some kind of intervention to tackle the problem. Okay, so why climate change? Like, why am I really passionate about this topic? So as I mentioned, I'll be sharing with you some interesting videos and facts and studies about climate change that motivated me to take on the project. But also I'll be tying these specific lessons about climate change or things that motivated me with the coding activities later. So you'll see how it all ties together. So I used all of these climate change images, videos, and information that I'll be sharing with you in the coding activities themselves. So first, let's see what made me really passionate about climate change. So green sea turtles, I'm not sure, I'm sure a lot of you have probably heard of this really interesting phenomenon that's occurring with green sea turtles. So when you think about climate change, usually, I find students are picturing, an abandoned polar bear on ice somewhere in the North or South Pole. That is accurate. Like, there are melting glaciers and ice, but that's not the only way that climate change affects the world. And I think it's really important for students to see how climate change connects with ecosystems around the entire world. And what I really love about this topic is that it impacts the entire world and various ecosystems in ways you don't really anticipate. So for example, did you imagine that the warming climate would turn all the offspring of green sea turtles into mostly females? So here's a great a video by the National Geographic that explains how this happens. Okay, actually, I'm going to pop over and see, are there any questions or anything that you guys want to mention so far before I continue? Okay, I'm just going to assume that everything's okay, and we'll keep going with the presentation. All right, so, oops. All right, so as I mentioned, it's not just melting glaciers, but permafrost as well. Just in case you're not familiar what permafrost is, it's any type of ground that has been frozen permanently. It doesn't thaw every year. It can be frozen from any amount of time, from 2 years to thousands of years. And obviously the rising global temperatures are causing this ground to thaw. And the permafrost is melting at unprecedented rates. Thawing permafrost has many effects. It's kind of like a freezer, and it freezes, microorganisms, animals, and it'll pause the decomposition of that organic matter. So when it melts, you're really thawing a lot of greenhouse gases. So for example, the Arctic currently has 2 times the amount of carbon that exists currently, plus a lot of methane. One study, which is linked there, it projects that 92 billion tons of carbon from now to 2100 would be released if it were all to be thawed. Another study, 15 million gallons of mercury, 2 times the amount found in oceans, the atmosphere, and soils combined. So I feel like it's not something that we are often discussing when we're talking about climate change, but it's obviously very important. So this map, you're going to see how about a quarter of the entire northern hemisphere has permafrost. So Alaska, Canadian Arctic, the Arctic Ocean, Greenland, Siberia, Mongolia. So a lot of the world has, permafrost, including the South American Andes, as you can see on the map, the New Zealand Southern Alps. So also in mountainous regions, not just, like land. That's just at land level. But you're also seeing permafrost on the floor of the Arctic Ocean as well. So it's really widespread. A quarter of the northern hemisphere. Unintended consequences. So when that permafrost thaws, it causes infrastructure to crumble. You can see pictures here of buildings in northern Russia collapsing, Alaskan roads shifting. 35 million people live in permafrost zones. So this would impact a lot of communities. Infrastructure repair costs would be really, really high. It would cost Northwest Territories approximately $51 million a year to repair that infrastructure that is crumbling. I really do love to show students these unintended consequences because then they can start to understand these far-reaching impacts of climate change in various ways affecting various communities that often are not discussed. So I do love to show these to them. It would impact various ecosystems. It creates thermokarsts. That's just like a land with very irregular surfaces that happens as the permafrost thaws. Drunken forests, as you can see in this image over here, sinkholes, exploding craters. This image in particular, I do find it very beautiful. This one is actually Siberia's Baragayka crater. So it's the largest in the world, formed by thawing permafrost. So though it's definitely beautiful, it does show you the sheer scale of the melting permafrost that's happening, which can also be equally concerning. So as I mentioned, it is like a deep freezer, microorganisms and animals are being frozen. So when it does thaw, this can lead to the revival of disease, which I do think is an important topic to cover with students because, everyone's felt the impact of COVID-19 firsthand and how serious it can be for diseases to be to spread around the world, but to be revived. Maybe we thought that we got rid of a disease or that it's been eradicated, and now it could be potentially revived because of thawing permafrost. So that's another unintended consequence that's really important to discuss. So this is a video. It's a great video. It does cover the revival of anthrax in reindeer that have been frozen in thawing permafrost in Siberia. It does have an image of them burning carcasses of reindeer. So I don't know if it's 100% you'd want to share it with your students, but for yourselves as educators to watch and understand the topic, I think it's great. So I'll be playing the video for you. Just 1 second.
In December 2016, a remote community in Siberia experienced a mysterious outbreak. 90 people were hospitalized and a 12-year-old boy died. Soon, Russian officials identified what had killed him, the deadly infectious disease anthrax. The outbreak had started among reindeer. To contain the spread, they burned over 2,000 reindeer carcasses. The strange thing was, there hadn't been an anthrax outbreak in the area for more than 70 years. So to figure out where it came from, scientists started looking underground. In the coldest parts of the world, there's a layer of the Earth that stays frozen all year. Every summer, the soil above it thaws, but this deeper layer stays hard as rock. This is permafrost. Most permafrost is here, in the northern hemisphere around the Arctic. And because it never thaws, permafrost acts kind of like the freezer in your kitchen. When plants and animals here die, they don't actually decompose. Instead, they become preserved in the frozen earth like a time capsule. And it's been that way for thousands of years. But that's changing. Today, humans are burning carbon and making the atmosphere warmer. And that's causing the permafrost to thaw and shrink. By 2100, only these areas will still have any permafrost. And that's causing some problems. When permafrost melts, the land above it becomes unstable, which can lead to landslides. Man-made structures start to fall apart as the ground underneath them collapses. And dead plants and animals that had been frozen for years are starting to thaw out. As they're exposed to air and bacteria, this organic material starts to decompose. That releases greenhouse gases like carbon dioxide and methane. But that's not all it releases. In Siberia, scientists think that the anthrax outbreak came from a long-dead reindeer carcass that thawed out along with the permafrost. Anthrax spores from the carcass would have spread across the area and infected reindeer grazing nearby. And it's not just anthrax. Scientists worry that as permafrost melts, it could unearth all sorts of diseases we thought we had under control. 35 million people live around permafrost. But the carbon released as permafrost melts will accelerate the impacts of climate change everywhere. Rising seas, heat waves, droughts in some places, and floods in others. And now we can add one more thing to that list. Diseases we thought we conquered.
Okay, so just want to check that everything's okay, good. It is a bit doom and gloom, this video, but it does show that climate change has far-reaching and totally unpredictable effects, especially in the developed nations. We don't necessarily see the day-to-day impacts of climate change, and it may not impact our communities, so we may not care as much. So this is why it's even more important to spread awareness of these other consequences of climate change that are not talked about often. If you're thinking about, an animal or a polar bear somewhere in the polar regions, it may seem like a really remote issue to you, but, a disease that could easily spread around the world. Now that really hits home, especially after COVID-19. So it could be a way to kind of make it more relatable for students. So keep going. Oops. Okay. So now to the actual coding activities and examples of how I tied in these lessons to coding activities in my classroom. So I'll be sharing a few projects that I did with my own students at St. Michael's Choir Schools using coding, and I'll be highlighting the ways that coding and technology could be used to spread awareness, to share data, and also to generate solutions. So the first set of examples that I want to show you demonstrate how climate change topics were used to contextualize coding activities. Usually when you're learning how to code online, a lot of the resources is just using random data. That there's no context to the activities. You're just using random data and you're just kind of plugging it in order to learn how to code. So I decided, why not just use actual climate change lessons and give context to these coding activities. So it's not meaningless, it's not random. There's context for the coding activities, and it can show students how meaningful data could be inputted, stored using a coding language. So I'll show you a couple of examples. So I was just talking to you about permafrost and melting permafrost and how it causes infrastructure to be unstable, or to, the ground can sink, for example. And so I would share this data with my students. So 22,000 kilometers of road, 8,800, 40% located in Canada, 20% in the Russian North, 20% in Alaska, and 20% in the Nordic region is crumbling due to melting permafrost. And so we use that to learn about something called logic and loops. Logic and loops is something that exists in all coding languages. It's not just Python. We learned Python, so these examples are using Python. So if you look up here, this is what I was talking about in terms of just using kind of random data. So you'd say, okay, data equals 0. And so the logic you're teaching students, they're called if statements. So if this equals that, then I want the computer to print it's a positive number, right? Or if it doesn't equal 0, or if it does equal 0, then print this, or else print this. So you're kind of teaching the computer these if statements, this logic, and then later on the computer can use your logic to do certain tasks. So instead of using random data like that, why not use the data that we were just exposed to in the climate change lessons? So using this permafrost data, students were able to do if statements. So if Alaska and Russia equal to 8,800 kilometer, or do not equal to 8,800 kilometers, then the computer will print not equal to Canada. Or else I want it to print might be equal to Canada. So you're essentially using this lesson that you would be learning in order to learn Python, but you're using the data that you just learned in the climate change lesson. And it's great because it also teaches students different operators. So there's also like mathematical reasoning there. So it's super fantastic. It's all in my resource that I'll be sharing with you in the end that have, you know, step-by-step instructions and that really, really simplify this and make it really easy for students and educators to learn. So here's another example. So using that lesson about green sea turtles to learn about something called object-oriented Python. So it sounds really complicated, object-oriented Python, but it's actually not very complicated. The idea is that you create these objects and you can store attributes or characteristics or data about that object. So, you know, here's an online activity where, okay, you say, okay, well, if I want a computer to store information about employees, you know, their name, I want them, you know, to have their, I don't know, personal information, their address, et cetera, you would create an object called employee. And then you would create, you know, different characteristics within that called, you know, their name, their phone number, et cetera. But, you know, instead of doing that, why don't we use the data about turtles? So I'm going to create an object called turtle, and in that object, I'm going to store information about the species, location, conservation status. And so you're learning how to do that. You're learning the language and the syntax, like what exactly to, you know, you're writing this word and then you're putting a period and then you're doing an equal sign. It's actually very straightforward to follow if you're following the lesson. And then you can ask the computer to, hey, you know what? I want to find out the location of green sea turtles. Can you please print the location of green sea turtle? And it'll print it for you here, Rain Island. Okay, computer, can you please find the conservation status for me? And it'll say endangered. So that's another example of a lesson that I was able to do with my students to really give the coding activity a little bit more context. So the next set of activities is how to use coding to actually generate some kind of solution, not just to give context. So here's an example of how we took data generated from the Mauna Loa Conservatory in Hawaii that collects atmospheric carbon dioxide levels. So we took that data, which is presented here, and there's also lists and tables. And so we used Python to visualize the data. So you can see the code is over here, okay? And, you know, we learned how to do the syntax, and we literally are just plugging in based on the format and the syntax of Python. And then you're able to generate this graph over here. So as you can see, the graph is important because it really visualizes that data. It shows trends. So this trend is, you know, concerning. And it gives students a clear idea of what this information actually means. Data visualization is important to spread awareness, show trends, and motivate people to take action. And we do it all the time in our geography classes, whether it's through maps, graphs, infographics. So this is another excellent way to visualize data. Here is another activity that we did. So like I mentioned at the beginning of the presentation, I was able to acquire a grant, a COVID-19 educators grant, and I was able to buy these coding kits. So the activities on my website don't require these kits at all. So you can do it literally just using a computer. But using these kits, we were able to do another data visualization activity where students were able to measure live the temperature, humidity of their rooms. Which was really, really fun. And they were able to sync it live to the cloud in real time. So that was really important because we later used this to actually create our own, you know, urban farms, which I'll be showing you guys. So vertical farms, this is another lesson that I like to show students because they're an excellent example of how coding and technology can be used to create and automate the farming process and mitigate the effects of climate change. So for example, by using a vertical farm, you're using less land, which is really important because it's vertical versus horizontal, which equates to less greenhouse gases being produced. You're using coding to code the machines to detect when a plant needs water. And this is an excellent example of using an if statement when coding, you know, like if, you know, the soil is this dry, then, you know, water the plants, or else don't water the plant. So that's an example of, you know, this if statement actually being used in the coding of these devices in vertical farms. So you're coding machines to detect when a plant needs water. So you're using a very specific amount of water versus just aimlessly watering all plants all the time, whether they need them or they don't. And so you're really efficiently using resources. So on top of that, there are many other mechanisms in the vertical farm, you know, collecting rainwater, filtering water, using solar panels, making some designs, but not all, but some designs of vertical farms extremely sustainable. So I will show you a video, but not the entire video. Oh, actually, let me, after this slide, I'll show you guys a video. So, you know, you can share with students the impact of urban farming in the environment. There's reduced transportation as well. Like I mentioned, less land being used, depending on the design, less or more energy, air filtering, cooling down cities in the summer, retaining precipitation, collecting stormwater. So that's really important. Okay, so here's the video. I'll just play the first minute.
With massive innovation in lighting technology over the last few years, vertical farms have all of a sudden gone from science projects to legitimate businesses capable of feeding lots of people. But as lighting costs go down and the technology improves, it's actually the future of these farms that I'm so interested in. Some people are turned off by the pristine mechanical growing conditions, like it's something out of the Matrix, but that's actually what makes it so exciting. Companies like Bowery Farming have the opportunity to re-engineer every aspect of the growing process, even down to the seeds they use, which are optimized for flavor instead of having to worry about insect and weather resistance. Using a system of robotics and automation, all running through what they call the Bowery operating system. Bowery is able to use 95% less water than traditional farms, use zero pesticides and chemicals, be 100 times more productive per square foot of land, and most importantly, build farms right next to cities to avoid the environmental impact of freighting food across the country and the world. So today, I'm here at Bowery's R&D facility to find out how they use technology to make every step of this process as efficient as possible.
So what's the point in the whole thing? Like why bother?
It's actually a legitimate question, right? When you look at farming today, it is the largest consumer of resources globally. 70% of the world's water every year goes to agriculture. And because of the chemically intensive way that we farm now, we've actually lost 30% of our arable farmland in just the last 40 years.
With massive innovation in lighting technology over the last
Okay, so I don't have time to play the whole video. It's quite long, but it does give you a good visual of what I was talking about and how some designs of these vertical farms are very sustainable. And after showing students all these wonderful examples, we then coded our own devices to, like I mentioned, measure the plant moisture, light, temperature, and humidity. So they kind of created their own urban farms and uploaded live data to the cloud. So I'll show you a few other videos. I'll just play the first minute as well of this one. I believe this is Singapore. Yeah.
Singapore is a low-lying island and city-state. 80% of its population live in high-rise public housing, resulting in one of the highest population densities in the world.
Challenges from rapid urbanization, sea level rise, and an increasingly chaotic climate is forcing planners and architects and policymakers to respond to critical questions about how cities of the future will cope with growing demand.
Despite the growing pressure on space, Singapore has been dubbed Asia's greenest city. So I've come here to meet some of the people who are helping it earn that title. My first stop is the Park Royal Hotel, which boasts 15,000 square meters of greenery and was completed in 2013 by award-winning architect Richard Hassel.
The Earth now in almost every way is being formed by human activity. So for us as architects, we feel like it's something within our control to suggest ways that building projects can also play a much stronger role in this stewardship of the Earth. When you look at like Google Earth or images from space, cities are really deserts. You see a very bright, white, shiny area surrounded by dark vegetation. If people build buildings like this, you would no longer see that. You would see the vegetation layer covering the city as well.
The Singaporean government awarded Park Royal its coveted platinum green mark.
Okay, so this is a great video of green architecture, which 100% uses a lot of technology as well to make it super efficient and sustainable. This is their actual vertical farm called Sky Greens. These are great videos to show students so you can start talking and discussing about the role of technology in terms of creating solutions.
Singapore has one of the highest population densities on the planet. More than 5 million people crowd into the small, wealthy island city. Land here comes at a premium, forcing people to expand up rather than out. And it's not just office towers and apartment complexes that are reaching skyward. Singapore now has one of the world's first commercial vertical farms. It's called Sky Greens.
This is a framework, is a greenhouse.
50-year-old entrepreneur Jack Ng, an engineer by training, the farm's owner and designer. Translucent structures nearly 4 stories tall line the property. On the inside, automated towers of vegetables rotate like Ferris wheels in slow motion between a nutrient-infused bath below and the sun above. Ng says each tower is powered by a gravity-fed water wheel. It's an ancient technology with a modern twist. Ng says one of the biggest benefits of this closed-loop hydraulic system is how little energy it consumes.
Electricity you use in Singapore is $3 per month for this whole tower.
That's $3 a month to run this entire tower, or about the same amount of electricity used in a single 60-watt light bulb.
You can try it. Yeah. Okay, you can refresh.
Eating local, freshly picked greens is a luxury in Singapore. With just 250 acres of farmland left, the city grows only 7% of the produce it consumes. That may be an extreme case, but it represents a looming problem facing cities all over the world, says Columbia University ecologist Dixon Espamier.
We're going to reach a tipping point very soon where traditional agriculture can no longer supply enough food for the people living on the planet.
He says producing enough food for the 3.5 billion people living in cities today requires an amount of land twice the size of South America.
That would be okay if we could stabilize our population at 7 billion, but that's not going to happen.
Espamier believes that 80% of the world's population will be living in cities by 2050, making today's challenges seem trivial by comparison.
The question arises, can we supply enough food for everybody on the planet, including a growing urban population? And I think we can. And I think we can do it by empowering people in the cities to grow food right there.
Sky Green's vertical farm offers one example of how that may be possible, not just technically, but also economically. The system is 10 times more productive per square foot than conventional farming. It also takes a lot less water, labor, and chemical inputs.
Singapore is currently looking very much into urban production.
Okay, so that gives you also a quick look at an example of a vertical farm in Singapore. So as I mentioned, we did create our own urban farm monitoring system using those coding kits. So I wanted to show you a quick video. It's only 11 seconds, but it'll play. So there it is, the plants, and I'm measuring live, you know, how much moisture there is in the soil, the temperature of the room, the humidity in the room. And so all students got to do that at home as I was running this virtual program during the pandemic. I'm just going to actually check quickly if there's any comments in the chat. Okay. So I will keep going because we don't have too much time left, actually. So sharing free resources, that's the last part of this presentation. So I did, you know, after creating all these lessons and activities with my students, I wanted to share it with educators for free. And so I created a website where you can access all of these lessons. And as I mentioned, they are extremely simple and straightforward because it is written by somebody with no coding background whatsoever. So do not feel intimidated to learn it if it's something that you want to take on. So in this actual presentation, I've shown you activities from lesson 5. That's the logic and loops, the if statements, where you talk about permafrost and use permafrost data. We also took a look at lesson number 7, object-oriented Python, using green sea turtles to create objects. I'd love to show you a little bit about from lesson, I showed you a little bit about lesson 8, numerical Python. That was where they created the graphs. So in the actual lesson, I can show you if we go on the website. So if we go to lesson 8, just to show you how the lessons are laid out, in case you're interested in trying them out. So, first you're covering a climate change topic. So the topic in this lesson is the albedo effect, and it has some data in it. And then it goes through step-by-step, instructions on how to create this graph and visualize the data. I just want to mention there are hyperlinks here to videos, articles, tons of resources, including a lot that I've covered in this presentation, like the videos and the information in this presentation. And so you can click those and access those as well in your lessons. And there's step-by-step instructions, and you go through it, and together you create that Mauna Loa Observatory graph, and you're visualizing that data. So that's the example I showed you guys earlier. And then later on, it asks students to then do the same, but for the albedo effect that they just learned about. And on the website, there are answer keys as well. So you can double check that your students can double check themselves if they've done the activity correctly by looking at the answer key. So every lesson, there's going to be an answer key available here. I'd also actually, since we have time, love to show you the culminating activity. So after learning all these different lessons, it's about putting it all together, seeing if students really understood all these Python lessons, but with a really interesting topic. So in this culminating task, students are comparing the percent of farmland, how much is being used for agriculture between two countries, the United States and Canada. So there are actually some interesting articles that are linked as well, but great questions that you can discuss with your students. So for example, how might factory farming reduce the amount of farmland needed for agriculture in the United States? Why are factory farms damaging to the environment? How might they contribute to climate change? So that's really about the United States. For China, why I chose China, it's really interesting, is that they have a growing agricultural sector. Tomatoes in a specific region of China are less juicy, and so they're actually easier to transport, and they make up 1/4 of the world's ketchup production. So when discussing agriculture in China, they're being exposed to this tomato industry, students, that is fueled by demand for ketchup. And there's a video link that's super great. I don't know if we have too much time to watch it, but it's a great one to show your students as well, or to watch yourself, that further explains how why there is this large-scale corporate agricultural production in China. And then students are asked to think about these questions. How did China incentivize farmers to produce food to meet the needs of their growing population? How might the distribution of China's agricultural production contribute to climate change? So that's the lesson aspect of the culminating task. And then they're asked to kind of put all their knowledge together from all the previous activities and take this data, which is the percent of land area used for agriculture in the United States versus China, and create a graph. They're also going to create if statements as well, create an object. So it's really putting all their knowledge together. They're using all the concepts from lessons 1 to 8, including the graph, including the logic and loops, storing data, and creating a graph, as I mentioned already. And the answers are available in the answer key. So that's available on the website edtechforchange.com that you can access afterwards if you want to take on this new challenge. So that does wrap up I do see that there are questions now. Okay, I will answer them. That does wrap up the actual presentation part of of this presentation using coding to create climate change. I hope it does inspire you to either learn something completely new or perhaps coding and use it in your geography lessons if you're interested. So let's take a look at the questions. Oh yes, the web address is edtechforchange.com. And I'm trying to see target grade level. I would say high school, grades 9 to 12, but I have done a few of these lessons with grade 7s and 8s. So after I ran it with grades 9 to 12, I did have quite a few students in the grade 7s and 8, grade 7 and 8 at my school that were really, really interested. And so I was able to do lessons 1 to 3 with them, and they've really enjoyed that. And actually, there is a link. I did create a link. I could share it with you of a Google Doc where I have all the resources that I've included in this presentation. So all the videos, all the articles, all the scientific papers that I've mentioned, books consulted. So I will share it with you. Hold on a second. 1 second. I will put it in the chat box. Let me just stop sharing my screen. If there's any other questions, please feel free to put them in the chat box, or any comments or anything about the presentation. It does feel strange kind of talking for an hour straight while I just get that Google Doc link for you guys. So I've put a Google Doc link there for you, and that has all the video links, article links from today. So if you're interested in watching the full videos, for example, please let me know if you're able to access it as well. And if there are any other questions, we do have a couple of minutes. You could unmute yourself if you'd like, or write something in the chat. Great. I'm really happy that the link works. It's been definitely a pleasure doing this program with my students, learning something new, and I really hope that you've enjoyed the presentation. So thank you so much for joining me. I know it's the summer, so it can be very challenging to convince yourself to attend some PD. So thank you, and I'm really excited about Antarctica. And I'd love to chat with you at some point, Janet, about your experience. Thank you very much.